Hello and welcome to the Unit 4 screencast, Part 1. This will take you through the beginning concepts we look at in our factor market unit and introduce you to a couple of essential graphs related to that. What we did at the very beginning of the unit was to think about things from a different point of view, and we went back to the circular flow of economic activity model that we looked at the beginning of the year. And instead of focusing down here on the product markets that we did during Unit 3, when we thought about monopolies and perfect competition and firms doing all the selling, we're now putting our focus up here in the factor market. And so we need to keep in mind that firms are the buyers and households are the sellers in these situations. So a lot of our concepts and a lot of our graphs will seem like they're backwards or upside down in some way, but that difference of role explains it. The old buyers are now the sellers and the old sellers are now the buyers. The next thing we did was to take a look and remind ourselves a little bit about marginal analysis. Marginal analysis for any form of economic decision making or a lot of decision making outside of Econ 2 is about finding the place where you've done all the situations you can do where marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost, but you never do any situations where marginal cost is greater than marginal benefit. So we find the right amount when marginal benefit and marginal cost intersect or cross. Now for the consumer, we looked at the consumer's theory of maximizing utility during Unit 2. Basically, they want to buy a product if the value of the marginal utility that product will give them is greater than the value of the money they have to spend to get it, which is basically the price. So comparing those two things told you whether buying it was a good decision. And for a long time, we studied firms in the product market, and they were going to sell one when marginal revenue was greater than marginal cost. We thought a little bit about how an individual would decide how much to work based on whether the wage, which is the marginal benefit you get from working another hour, would be greater or less than the marginal value of your leisure time. So what's the next hour of doing whatever you want to do worth to you? Economists sometimes call that the marginal disvalue of labor, like how much do you hate going to work? It's exactly how much you would enjoy the next hour of doing something you chose. Most of Unit 4 is going to focus on this row right here of the graph, the grid, this one right there. And so we're thinking about marginal revenue product and marginal factor cost or marginal resource cost. We'll get some specific information about those in just a moment. And we're taking the point of view of a firm acting as the buyer or demander in the factor market. The last unit of microeconomics is going to be about comparing marginal social benefit, marginal social cost. We'll be thinking through the eye of society, trying to achieve allocative efficiency or avoid deadweight loss. But let's get to that later. So really we're thinking about this row right here, and the key questions we're going to try to unpack during this unit is how many units of a resource, for example labor, should the firm employ? And what's the cheapest input combination the firm can use to produce their profit maximizing level of output? This video is going to cover that first one a little bit and some graphical ways to think about that first question. And we'll leave the second one and some of the advanced graphical interpretations for another video. We looked at derived demand, which is basically the idea that demand for a resource comes from the demand for the products that resource helps create. A conversation in class where we thought about if people didn't want to drink coffee anymore, then there wouldn't be much demand for baristas, and there also wouldn't be as much demand for coffee growing farmland or coffee pickers in countries where coffee is produced. And the idea is that changes in product demand are reflected in factor demand, and that's just the same direction. Demand for coffee goes to the left, then demand for all of the resources that it takes to make coffee also shifts to the left. The second big concept in understanding how we do factor markets is the idea of marginal revenue product. And here we're thinking basically about marginal revenue product of labor, but you could have marginal revenue product of capital or of land, any resource that's used to create a product. What we're asking here is how much will total revenue change when I use one more unit of an input? So when I hire one more worker or one more labor hour, how much will total revenue change? We can use delta L or delta QL. It's really important not to just use delta Q, because delta Q would be referring to units of the firm's output, not units of the input that they're hiring. We're basically asking the question of how much in money the next worker is worth to the firm, or how much they increase the total revenue of the firm. If that were a negative number, that means that hiring that next worker would decrease the total revenue of a firm. They wouldn't want to do that because hiring that worker would, of course, increase their cost. MRP either is the demand for labor or it's closely related to the demand for labor. And we'll figure out some examples of where it is and some examples where it's just closely related. But demand for labor, the very first thing you should think of is MRP, and probably right behind it would be derived demand. You can, of course, calculate the marginal revenue product of, say, the third worker hired with this green formula up here at the top of the screen. You would just sort of say, well, okay, if we had 2 workers we hired, how much would our total revenue be? And if we had 3 workers that we hired, how much we produce, how much we sell those to, how much would our total revenue be? And then you subtract total revenue with 2 workers from total revenue with 3 workers, and you end up with marginal revenue product of that third worker. So that's a way that will always work. You have a shortcut of calculating it right in here that will work, but only if the firm is a price taker, only if they sell their goods in a perfectly competitive product market. Well, what does that mean? That means that when they produce more goods, they hire another worker, they make more goods, the product price doesn't change. So now what we can do is say, for example, like in your packet you had the Acme yo-yo example. Well, one more worker at the yo-yo factory adds maybe 10 yo-yos, and each yo-yo maybe is worth $5. So perhaps that worker is worth $50 to the firm in MRP. 2 quick cautionary notes, other concepts we've learned about earlier on in the trimester, but that are distinct from MRP. Students often will confuse these with MRP erroneously, and you want to avoid making those mistakes. Marginal revenue product is not quite the same as marginal revenue. Marginal revenue product is how much does total revenue change when I hire another worker, and this one is how much does total revenue change when I make another unit. It's the same formula as the green one up here, except for MR, you would just have delta Q down here. So you can see that's why it's so important to distinguish delta L from delta Q. Delta L is one more worker, delta Q is one more unit of output. Marginal revenue product is also distinct from marginal physical product. We use marginal product of labor or marginal physical product of labor to describe how many more units of output will we get if we hire one more worker. When you did your experiment at the link factory, you calculated marginal product of labor because you said, well, when we have 3 workers, we make 6 links. When we have 4 workers, we make 7 links. So that 4th worker adds 1 link of output. That's how much that worker is worth to you in output, but that's distinct from how much that worker is worth to you in money. So that's a thing to clarify a little bit there. Another big concept, and of course these two are the huge two, because marginal revenue product and marginal factor cost are the things we're setting equal to each other, this whole unit. Marginal factor cost is change in total cost over change in units of labor employed. And that's the same as marginal resource cost. So you might see this as MRC, you might see it as MFC, talking about the same thing. Don't stress about any difference there. Marginal resource cost or factor cost is the amount total cost rises, one more unit of a factor of production is employed. So that's very closely related to the wage rate, because you got to pay that new worker the wage rate, and it's also very closely related to the supply of labor. Okay, so from there, what we need to do is think a little bit about how this shows up graphically in 2 key models. And so the first model we're looking at, we can call the wage taker model. And here we're thinking about what it's like for perfectly competitive, for firms that are hiring their workers in a perfectly competitive labor market. And anything that we say about this model right here, we could say of a perfectly competitive market for capital or land or any other resource. We just tend to use labor as our typical example. Just like with perfect competition in the product market, we have a market graph and a firm graph. And so here we're thinking about, say, the market for workers in Iowa City. And here we're thinking about whether we should hire one more worker at our restaurant that we have. And the assumption we're making is that there are bunches and bunches and bunches, maybe even infinity, an infinite number of similarly situated firms who are hiring their workers in a big pool of undifferentiated labor. So this would be like unskilled laborers in the whole city. And hence we have capital L's and capital QL's down over here. Whereas over here, we have lowercase l's and QL's, thinking about this is my firm maybe hiring 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 workers, whereas this is 8,000, 9,000, 10,000, 11,000, 12,000 workers working in the town. Let's take these lines on this graph one at a time. This should look a little bit familiar to you, but we'll think about the different lines as we go here. Once, real quick, just to note, the vertical axis is wage rate. Well, that's basically price. That's the price of a unit of labor, a wage for working, say, another hour or another day, depending on the example given. Okay, so let's start here with the supply of labor curve. What would that be determined by? Well, who are the suppliers of labor? The suppliers of labor are workers, households, what we might have thought of before as consumers, but now they're sellers of labor. And each one of them has a reservation wage, saying like, if the wage rate is below this amount, then I don't want to work. That's the minimum amount I'm willing to accept to trade away my labor. And if you line all those up at higher wage rates, more people will be willing to work. And some folks that would only work part-time down here will work full-time. So more units of labor are employed, the higher the wage rate. That's what S sub L is showing you right there. And that's going to shift to the right if we have an influx of workers in the city, and it's going to shift to the left if we have people move out of the city. It's going to shift to the right if workers are willing to work for a lower and lower wage rate. It would shift to the left if workers need more and more and more wages to get them to show up for work. Those are some of the things that might cause L, S, or S sub L to shift. And LS is fine, S sub L, same thing there, okay? All right, let's now think a little bit about this line here. This line is the demand for labor. And where does that come from? Well, who wants to buy workers? Firms want to buy workers. Why do they want to buy workers? Because they help them produce products that those people end up wanting to buy. So this comes from the sum total of all the firms' individual demands for labor, which is this line over here. So just as in the product market, the supply curve came from being a sum total of all the firms' marginal cost curves, it's the same kind of idea. If I say at $10 an hour, this firm wants to buy this many, well, there's like 1,000 similarly situated firms. So at $10 an hour, now we have, maybe 4,000 workers that firms want to hire. Well, if it's only, $9 an hour, I want to buy 6 workers. And at $9 an hour, maybe 6,000 workers are demanded because there's 1,000 similarly situated firms looking to buy unskilled, undifferentiated labor. I am a wage taker. This horizontal line, which is a dotted line over here, just signaling where is W star, the equilibrium market wage rate, and where is L star, the equilibrium market number of workers employed. Just as those are dotted reference lines over here, the horizontal one becomes a solid line because that is my supply of labor curve that I face. It is the market wage rate, it is the marginal resource cost, and the marginal factor cost. Let's figure out why. Let's say the equilibrium wage rate is $8 an hour. And so here, if I want to hire one worker, I have to pay them $8 an hour. If I want to hire 2 workers, I got to pay each one $8 an hour. If I want to hire 3 workers, I got to pay each one $8 an hour. Workers are available to me for $8 an hour. In fact, you could say I could hire any number of workers I want for $8 an hour each. And if I do, it does not change the market wage rate. That's what means I'm a wage taker. So if you see that a firm can hire as many workers as it wants and they give you a specific wage rate, you know that is a wage taking firm. There we go. How much does my marginal factor cost of hiring an additional worker come out to be? Well, how much does total cost increase when I hire one more worker? I don't have to change the wage rate for all the previous workers. I just hire one more for $8 more. So all that happens is I add $8 to my total cost, no matter how many workers I hire. So that kind of explains why all 4 of these concepts are the same horizontal line there. Marginal revenue product. To be super exact, if you wanted to, you could draw it as an upside down swoosh with a little hook shape up in here. It was easier for me to do it on this program as a downsloping line, and it's never wrong for you to draw it as a downsloping line. But the idea is that because each worker adds fewer and fewer units of output, each worker also adds less and less money to the firm's total revenue. And so that's why marginal revenue product of labor is downsloping. I find the place where marginal revenue product and marginal factor cost equal each other, boom, right there, and I go down, and that determines the equilibrium number of workers that my firm wants to hire, lowercase l star. That's not a 1, that's a italic L, but it didn't turn out very well. A couple of things that it says we should be able to show on the side of this graph. We need to show why MRP changes. Well, MRP would shift to the right if workers became more valuable to a firm. What would make them more valuable to a firm? Either the goods they produce are more valuable, product price increased, or the workers add more goods, marginal physical product of labor increased. So if workers produce more goods, MRP increases, and if workers produce more valuable goods, MRP would increase. Those are the two giant shifters of MRP that you really must know. Okay. Now, what if I had a new technology at my firm that allowed my firm only to increase output per worker? I would shift this to the right, and of course I would come over here and I would hire that many for my new L star. Would anything change over here? No. One firm is not presumed to be able to really change this line because it's composed of so many smaller firms. What else? If there was a change in labor supply. We talked about that one earlier. Let's say that a bunch of new potential workers move to the town. Well, now the labor supply curve shifts that way. This is going to push the market wage rate down a bit, and the equilibrium quantity of workers hired in the market will increase. And of course, my firm will respond to the lower wage rate by hiring a few more workers, larger number L2. You can play around with other shifts there. I presume it's not so difficult to see the effect there. If, for example, SL shifted to the left, you should be able to tell that wage rate increases, and both large and small L star would decrease. What else? Entry of new hiring firms. What if there were more firms? Well, each firm's MRP might stay the same, but if there were more firms, this might increase. And if it did, well, of course, that would drag. Now there's more units of labor hired in the town, and it also raises up the wage rate. And at the new higher wage rate, my firm's L2 will decrease. So that's a situation where L star over here increased and L star over there decreased. And you might kind of go through and do that denotation with L1s and L2s to kind of confirm that for yourself because the L's moved in opposite directions. What if there was a minimum wage put in place in the town? Well, for starters, any minimum wage that was below W star would have no effect whatsoever because a minimum wage is a price floor, and a price floor doesn't do anything if it happens below equilibrium. What about up here? What if we put a wage rate up there? Well, essentially for the firm and for all the other firms in the town, it feels like you just moved W up there. So what happens? Well, firms want to hire fewer workers. I think more workers actually want to work, so there may be a gap there, a structural unemployment gap. Anyway, this firm certainly hires fewer workers as well. So you can think about a couple different levels of minimum wage that might work and affect that market. Super important to understand perfectly competitive factor markets, what we call the wage taker model. It shares a lot of characteristics in common with the price taker model, but just to reiterate what was said in class about how a firm could be a wage taker and not a price taker, or it could be a price taker and not a wage taker. So you have to look for separate clues in the questions you're answering to determine whether the firm is supposed to be both or just one of those things. All right, let's take just a minute and introduce the idea of the wage seeker model, or a monopsony concept here. So this is a graph that looks like this. I think it was on the board for you a little bit, but we didn't really talk about how it works. We'll just sort of talk about maybe these first few things up here in this part of the video, and then cut it off and perhaps address some of these other ones in a later piece. Okay? So let's go down here and think about what is the big idea of monopsony. Because without an understanding of the big idea of monopsony, it might be very difficult to get a hold on what's going on with this graph. Okay? We're going to think about a situation where there's one firm doing all the hiring. Because they're the only buyer, they face the entire market supply of labor curve, just as a monopolist faces the whole market demand curve. This slopes up because of the reservation wages of the potential labor pool. So there's more people that want to work, and people want to work more units of labor if the wage is higher. The firm is presumed not to be able to wage discriminate, and therefore they can't hire more workers without raising the wage for all of their workers. And that's going to give us the result that MFC slopes up more steeply than supply of labor. And the marginal resource cost, or marginal factor cost, of hiring one more worker will be greater than the wage rate that we pay to that worker. Well, that's quite a mouthful. Let's sort of see how that plays out on the graph, because I think it's maybe simpler than it sounds. Let's start with this line right here, supply of labor. Okay, go ahead and think of that as an upsloping line. And just strategically, I like to draw it not so steep, because it gives me room to draw something steeper going upward and not have things too squunched up on my graph. At any rate, why does that one slope up? Well, it's really the same reason that this one sloped up right over here. It's because there's a bunch of us, and some of us want to be paid more to work because we feel like we're more valuable and we have more mouths to feed at home, or we've got more education, training, and experience. But at any rate, at low wages, not very many of us want to work. And as you raise up that wage rate, more and more and more of us are willing to show up to work. And at very high wage rates, people probably will move from places far away or commute from places that are further away to work here. So that's the idea of the upsloping supply of labor curve. Now, why is it upsloping for this firm when it wasn't before for those other firms? These firms are just hiring a small slice of the workers that are hired in the town. And so they only see a narrow window of that. I'm hiring pretty much everybody in the town. So if I want to hire more of them, I have to raise the wage rate that I pay. It's not the case that I can hire as many workers as I want for $8 an hour or $100 a day or whatever. I have to actually pay more if I want more people to show up. Now, let's think now about what is up with MFC and MRC, because that's the other sort of new beast that we have to think about here. Why is it separate and why is it steeper? That's a thing you'll be asked sometimes. And it's kind of like, why is MR separate and steeper than demand in a monopoly? Let's see if this explanation kind of works. Remember that we've presumed down here that the firm cannot wage discriminate. So let's think about the following example. I'll make it really simple and see if we can generalize from that. Let's say that at $1 an hour, there's one worker who wants to work. And at $2 an hour, there are two workers who want to work. And at $3 an hour, there are three workers that want to work. So S sub L is just telling us, hey, QL equals W. That's a pretty simple kind of equation. What happens when I go from hiring 0 workers to hiring 1? Well, my total factor cost goes from no dollars, 0 workers at $0 an hour, to $1, one worker at $1 an hour. What happens when I add another worker? Well, now I want to hire 2 workers, but I have to pay each of them $2 an hour. The wage rate is 2. The quantity of labor I'm hiring is 2. But my marginal factor cost is now 3. Because my total factor cost, 2 workers at $2 an hour, is $4. And it went up from $1 to 4 for a change of 3. Let's rinse and repeat and see if that fits us again. Let's say at $3 an hour, 3 people want to work. I want to hire 3 workers now. What's my total factor cost? $3 times 3 workers is 9. How much did it increase by? It went from 4 to 9. So there's going to be a point, quantity 3, MFC of 5. But wage is only at 3. So you can see here already, MFC is greater than wage, and it's sloping up faster. What if I hire 4 workers at $4 an hour? Well, here's 4. The wage is 4, but my total factor cost went from 9 to 16. So marginal factor or resource cost is actually 7 in this case. So you see the total cost when I add a worker is rising by more than the wage. I've got to pay that new worker $4, and then each of the previous 3 workers is earning an extra dollar every hour. So that's why it was 7 of an increase in cost. One more time, if I go to 5 workers at $5 an hour, 25, marginal factor cost of 9, wage only 5. So you can see why MRC or MFC is greater than wage, hopefully. Just like a perfectly competitive wage-taking firm up here, of course, when I add workers, we make more, but we're subject to the principle of diminishing marginal returns to labor, so they don't add as much to the chain. And for that reason, I would have a hook-shaped or just downward sloping line that is my marginal revenue product of labor. So how much each worker is worth to the firm decreases as I add more workers. In this case, it's not actually my demand for labor because I don't actually have a demand curve for labor. What am I going to do in terms of deciding how to hire workers? I'm going to hire the quantity where MFC equals MRC right there. I'm going to go down and say that's my L star. That is my profit maximizing quantity of labor to hire. Then I'm going to pick my wage rate. And I don't want to pay this wage rate up here because then, gosh, I would have tons of people showing up to work. I don't want that many people. I only want L star workers. Why wouldn't I pay the lowest wage possible to get L star workers to show up? So my profit maximizing process, if I am a wage seeker, is 2-step, just like if I was a price seeker. A monopolist said MC equals MR and then up to demand. I'm going to say MFC equals MRP and go down to supply and come over here to my wage rate. And that's probably enough for introducing you to the basic idea here. And then in a subsequent episode, we will see a little bit about some of those things. But you should be able to think about some of those things and kind of work them through. The minimum wage is probably the toughest one. Thank you.